My property sits at the edge of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque rural-suburban blend where open fields gradually give way to manicured lawns and cookie-cutter homes. I purchased this 5-acre lot specifically for its privacy. The way the oak trees form a natural barrier between my modest farmhouse and the expanding development beyond. The private road that runs along the eastern edge of my property has been in my family since my grandfather built it 60 years ago, connecting our land to the main county road. The road itself is nothing special to look at, just a quarter-mile stretch of well-maintained gravel that winds through a small copse of trees before emerging near my farmhouse. My grandfather had installed it as a secondary access point when the property extended further, and when I inherited the place, the deed clearly established the road as private property with no easements or shared access agreements. Every weekend I would spend time maintaining that road, filling potholes, clearing fallen branches, and ensuring proper drainage during rainy seasons. The road represented something important to me. It was a boundary, a symbol of independence in a world increasingly defined by community regulations and restrictions. The neighboring Oak Ridge Heights community had formed their homeowners association 5 years ago. From my vantage point, I watched as individual expressions slowly vanished from the neighborhood. Mailboxes became uniform black metal boxes. House colors shifted to approved shades of beige, gray, and muted blue. Gardens conformed to prescribed layouts and plant selections. Even holiday decorations seemed to follow an unspoken template of acceptability. I had heard stories from friends who lived under HOA rule. Tales of arbitrary fines for grass half an inch too tall, citations for unauthorized wind chimes, and heated disputes over trash placement dominated neighborhood gossip. I considered myself fortunate to live just outside their jurisdiction, free to paint my mailbox bright red and let wildflowers grow alongside my vegetable garden. My interactions with HOA board members had been limited but cordial. Occasionally, I would exchange pleasantries with Patricia Wilcox, the HOA president, when our paths crossed at the local hardware store. She was always impeccably dressed with perfectly coiffed silver hair that never moved, even in strong wind. Her smile never quite reached her eyes when she asked about my quaint little property. Roger Danforth, the HOA treasurer, would wave from his luxury SUV when driving past. He had once stopped to compliment my garden, though his comments felt backhanded. "So refreshingly rustic," he had said, examining my heirloom tomatoes with the air of someone observing primitive art. Though I do wonder about property values with such unconventional landscaping in the area. I maintained polite distance, recognizing the cultural chasm between us. They viewed my property as an anomaly in their vision of suburban perfection. I viewed their community as an exercise in conformity I wanted no part of. This unspoken tension remained manageable until early spring, when I noticed surveying equipment appearing near my road. At first, it seemed innocuous. Perhaps county workers assessing drainage or utility companies planning upgrades. But then I spotted Patricia and 2 other board members walking along my road's edge, pointing and making notes. They quickly dispersed when they saw me approaching. That evening, I noticed freshly placed wooden stakes with bright orange ribbons marking regular intervals along my private road. Something was happening, and the fact that no one had approached me about it sent the first warning signal that trouble was brewing on the horizon. The morning that changed everything began like any other Tuesday. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping black coffee and reading news on my tablet. My border collie, Max, dozed at my feet, occasionally twitching in doggy dreams. The spring sun filtered through east-facing windows, casting warm light across the worn wooden floor. This peaceful routine had become sacred to me after 15 years of corporate commuting. The first tremor that interrupted this tranquility was subtle, a distant rumble that made my coffee ripple. Max lifted his head, ears perked toward the window. I dismissed it initially, assuming it was thunder from an approaching storm. But when Max suddenly bolted upright and raced to the front door barking furiously, I knew something was wrong. I stepped onto my porch just in time to witness an industrial bulldozer turning onto my private road, followed by two large dump trucks loaded with gravel and construction materials. Behind them, a procession of pickups bearing the Oak Ridge Heights Community Development logo on their doors formed a convoy that stretched back to the main road. The coffee mug nearly slipped from my hand. Without thinking, I rushed down my porch steps and sprinted toward the construction vehicles, waving my arms frantically. The bulldozer operator noticed me approaching and reluctantly eased off the throttle, the massive machine grinding to a halt on my gravel road. "This is private property," I shouted over the rumbling engine. "You cannot bring those vehicles through here." The operator, a burly man with a weathered face, looked genuinely confused. He pulled a crumpled document from his shirt pocket and passed it down to me. "Management gave me these papers, said we had all the proper authorization to use this access road for the new development." I scanned the document with growing disbelief. It was a construction permit for Oak Ridge Heights Phase 3 expansion, with a crudely drawn map showing construction vehicle access through what was unmistakably my private road. But there was no signature from me, no legal easement, nothing that would actually authorize this use. "Who gave you this?" I demanded, my voice rising with indignation. The man shrugged. "Talk to management," he replied, pointing toward the HOA office at the entrance to the subdivision. "I just go where they tell me." I stood my ground in front of the bulldozer. "You need to turn these vehicles around now. This road is my private property, and I have given no permission for construction access." After a tense standoff, the operator radioed his supervisor. Several minutes later, the vehicles reluctantly backed up and returned to the main road. I watched them retreat, my heart still pounding with adrenaline and anger. This was no accident or misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately misrepresented access rights to my property. I drove immediately to the Oak Ridge Heights Community Center where the HOA maintained their office. The receptionist tried to deny me access, claiming Patricia was in meetings all day, but I refused to leave. After 20 minutes of insistence, Patricia Wilcox finally emerged from her office, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, gesturing me into her immaculate office. "What brings you here in such a state?" "Your construction crews just tried to use my private road without permission," I said, placing the document on her desk. "This shows my road as designated construction access, but I never authorized this." Patricia barely glanced at the paper. "Oh, there must be some miscommunication. We are simply implementing community improvements that will benefit everyone in the area. Surely you want to be a good neighbor and support progress." Her condescending tone made my blood pressure rise. Being a good neighbor does not mean allowing unauthorized use of private property. "It is just temporary access," she said dismissively. "The alternative route would add significant costs to our project, costs that would be passed on to hardworking families." I left her office without resolution, her platitudes about community spirit and cooperation ringing hollow. Upon returning home, I discovered an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a formal letter requesting a temporary community access easement for construction vehicles. The letter was dated 6 weeks earlier, but had never been delivered. The final paragraph casually mentioned integration of my road into the community infrastructure as part of their neighborhood unification plan. That night, as I reread the documents, a chilling realization settled over me. This was not a mistake or oversight. The HOA had been planning this takeover all along, attempting to create a situation where I would have no choice but to comply with their demands. They had already begun implementation, counting on my eventual surrender in the face of their determination. The next morning, I called in sick to my part-time consulting job. This situation required my full attention. I spread property documents across my dining table, examining deed restrictions, property lines, and access rights dating back to when my grandfather first purchased the land in 1963. The original survey clearly delineated the road as private property with no public easements or rights of way. I photographed the construction stakes that had been placed along my road without permission, documenting their precise locations with GPS coordinates. I created a timeline of events, noting each interaction with HOA representatives and construction personnel. If this escalated further, I wanted comprehensive documentation of every boundary violation. By midday, my eyes burned from scrutinizing legal documents and county records. I needed professional guidance. My friend Thomas had mentioned a property attorney who had helped him with boundary disputes the previous year. I called immediately and secured an appointment for that afternoon. The law offices of Barrett and Holloway occupied a modest building downtown. Evelyn Barrett, a no-nonsense attorney in her 60s with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for directness, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She examined my property documents, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "They have absolutely no legal right to your road. None," she finally said, tapping my grandfather's original deed with her pen. "Their actions constitute trespassing and potentially illegal conversion of private property." "Could they claim easement by necessity or adverse possession?" I asked, having spent hours researching these terms. She shook her head firmly. "Impossible under these circumstances. Easement by necessity requires landlocked property, which they do not have. Adverse possession would require years of open, notorious use of your road, which has not occurred. What they are attempting is a straightforward property grab, hoping you will not understand your rights or be intimidated into compliance." Her certainty provided immense relief. I was not overreacting. My property rights were being deliberately violated by people who assumed I would not fight back effectively. Armed with legal confirmation, I intensified my investigation. I visited the county records office and requested all recent permit applications filed by Oak Ridge Heights HOA. A sympathetic clerk granted me access to the development plans for their new construction phase. What I discovered sent ice through my veins. The architectural renderings for Oak Ridge Heights Phase 3 showed a new entrance connecting directly to my private road. The plans labeled it as Community Access Road, with no indication it was privately owned. Even more disturbing, a planned clubhouse and community pool would sit adjacent to my property line, with parking lot access routing directly through what was currently my private driveway. Leaving the county office, I stopped at a local real estate agency where display windows showcased new Oak Ridge Heights properties. The glossy brochures prominently featured convenient secondary access as a selling point for new homes. Digital renderings depicted happy families driving along what was unmistakably my private road. The brochures were dated 3 months earlier, long before any approach had been made to me about access rights. That evening, I parked near the subdivision entrance and observed construction vehicles attempting to use alternate routes. The existing community roads were too narrow for large equipment, causing traffic snarls and angry reactions from current residents. Several vehicles had difficulty navigating tight turns, scraping against curbs and damaging landscaping. It became clear why the HOA wanted my straight, direct access road so badly. Their expansion plans were untenable without it. Over the next week, I meticulously documented every instance of trespassing. Construction vehicles attempting to use my road despite my explicit prohibition. HOA board members accidentally wandering onto my property to examine the road. Surveyors placing additional markers without permission. Each incident strengthened my case of deliberate and coordinated property rights violations. My attorney advised installing visible, no trespassing, and private road signs at regular intervals. I added security cameras that captured clear footage of Patricia Wilcox personally removing one of these signs, placing it in her vehicle trunk before driving away. This brazen act of property interference was particularly damning evidence of their intentions. The deeper I investigated, the clearer the picture became. The HOA had developed their expansion plans assuming they could pressure me into surrendering my road rights. They had already sold homes advertising access via my property. Construction timelines depended on using my road for equipment access. Their entire project hinged on my compliance, yet they had never secured legal permission. My hands trembled not from fear but from determination as I organized my evidence. Years of living quietly, avoiding conflict and maintaining polite distance had created the impression I could be easily manipulated or intimidated. The HOA had mistaken my preference for privacy as weakness. They had calculated wrong. This was my property, my boundary, my right to defend. And defend it I would with every legal resource available. After 2 intensive weeks gathering evidence and consulting with my attorney, I was ready to formally challenge the HOA. Evelyn Barrett prepared a comprehensive cease and desist letter citing specific violations of property law, documented instances of trespassing, and demands for immediate removal of all survey markers from my land. The letter concluded with a deadline for compliance and warned of legal action should the violations continue. Rather than send the letter by mail where it might be accidentally misplaced, I chose to deliver it personally during the monthly HOA meeting. This would ensure maximum visibility and prevent the board from hiding their actions from community members. Evelyn advised against this confrontational approach, but I felt strongly that public accountability was necessary. The community center parking lot was full when I arrived that Thursday evening. I entered quietly, taking a seat in the back row as Patricia Wilcox reviewed landscape maintenance guidelines with robotic precision. Board members noticed my presence immediately. I watched Roger Danforth whisper urgently to Patricia, whose rhythm faltered briefly before continuing her presentation. When the meeting opened for community concerns, I raised my hand. Patricia attempted to skip over me, but several residents had noticed and pointed out her oversight. With reluctance evident in her tight smile, she acknowledged me. "We have an unexpected guest. Please state your business quickly as we have many agenda items to cover." I stood, walking deliberately to the front of the room. The weight of 40 pairs of eyes followed my movement. I placed copies of my cease and desist letter on the table before each board member, then turned to address the gathered residents. "My name is James Morrison. I own the property adjacent to your community, including the private road that runs alongside the eastern boundary." I spoke clearly, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I am here because your HOA board has been attempting to appropriate my private property for community use without legal right or proper compensation." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Patricia quickly attempted to regain control. This is not an appropriate forum for personal property disputes. We can discuss this privately at another time. With respect, I continued, undeterred. This is precisely the appropriate forum, as your board has been making decisions affecting community development without disclosing critical information to residents. I methodically presented evidence of their actions, displaying photographs of removed signage, trespassing construction vehicles, and misleading marketing materials. Several homeowners looked increasingly uncomfortable, whispering among themselves. "We are simply trying to improve our community," Patricia interjected, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Why would anyone object to progress that benefits everyone?" "I do not object to community improvement," I replied. "I object to the illegal appropriation of private property and deliberate misrepresentation to contractors and homebuyers." I turned to face the residents directly. "Did any of you know that the access road shown in your Phase 3 plans is privately owned? That the board has been planning construction routes through property they have no legal right to use? That homes have been sold advertising access via a road that belongs to me, not to this community?" The room temperature seemed to drop as residents turned questioning gazes toward their board. For the first time, I noticed cracks in Patricia's composed facade. Her smile tightened, eyes hardening with calculation rather than concern. "Mr. Morrison clearly misunderstands our community vision," she stated flatly. "We have professional planners and attorneys who have reviewed all aspects of our development program. This is simply a misunderstanding that we will address privately." Roger Danforth leaned forward, dropping his usual congenial manner. "You might want to consider the cost of opposing an entire community, Mr. Morrison. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. Surely we can reach a reasonable arrangement that avoids unnecessary conflict." The threat beneath his words was unmistakable. Several homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension building. An older gentleman in the front row stood up. "I bought my home here 8 months ago specifically because the salesperson promised a second entrance that would cut my commute time by 15 minutes. Are you saying that entrance is actually illegal?" Before the board could respond, other questions erupted from concerned residents. The meeting devolved into chaos as Patricia repeatedly banged her gavel, calling vainly for order. I quietly returned to my seat, watching the confrontation I had catalyzed unfold. After 20 minutes of heated exchange, Patricia abruptly adjourned the meeting, promising to address misconceptions in an upcoming special communication. As I walked to my car afterward, small clusters of residents had formed in the parking lot. Some cast resentful glances my way, clearly viewing me as an obstacle to their improved property values and convenient access. Others approached cautiously, introducing themselves and asking questions about the situation. One woman whispered that the board had been increasing assessment fees specifically to fund the expansion project, with no transparency about potential legal obstacles. That night my phone buzzed repeatedly with text messages from unfamiliar numbers. "You are making powerful enemies," one read. Another suggested accidents happen to troublemakers. The most disturbing simply stated, "Holdouts get bulldozed." I forwarded each message to Evelyn, documenting the escalating intimidation. Rather than frightening me into submission, these tactics only strengthened my resolve. If they resorted to anonymous threats rather than legal remedies, it confirmed my position was legally sound. They had no legitimate claim to my property, and both they and I knew it. This was no longer just about protecting my private road. It had become about standing firm against bullying and manipulation, about defending not just property lines but principles. 3 days after the confrontational HOA meeting, I was driving home from the hardware store where I had purchased additional security cameras for my property. My mind was occupied with practical concerns about mounting angles and power sources when something caught my eye just beyond the main intersection near Oak Ridge Heights. A small, "For sale by owner" sign stood partly obscured by tall grass on a triangular lot I had driven past hundreds of times without particular notice. I pulled over, curiosity piqued by the location. The sign listed only a phone number, no realtor information or price details. The triangular parcel itself seemed unremarkable, perhaps 3/4 of an acre of undeveloped land covered mostly in wild grasses and a few young trees. What made my heart race was its precise position at the junction where my private road connected to the county highway, directly adjacent to the planned Oak Ridge Heights expansion area. I walked the perimeter of the lot slowly, seeing it with new eyes. This unassuming patch of land controlled the access point between public roads and my private driveway. If someone were to purchase this property and restrict passage, it would effectively become a bottleneck controlling entry to both my road and potentially the HOA's planned construction route. With trembling fingers, I dialed the number on the sign. A gruff voice answered, identifying himself as Earl Harmon, an elderly farmer who had owned various parcels in the area for decades. The triangular lot was one of his last holdings, deemed too small for agricultural use and oddly shaped for building. He was asking $45,000, considered high for undeveloped land in our area, but reasonable given its road frontage. "Has anyone from Oak Ridge Heights expressed interest in the property?" I asked casually. "Those subdivision folks? Nah," Earl replied. "They probably figure they can just build around it. Not much you can do with a funny-shaped piece like this anyway." I arranged to meet Earl that afternoon to discuss the purchase further. Before meeting him, I called my friend Melissa, a local realtor who had helped me purchase my home years earlier. Without revealing my specific interest, I asked about the general value of oddly shaped lots with road frontage in our area. Her assessment confirmed that Earl's asking price, while high, was within reasonable market range. I also contacted Evelyn Barrett, explaining my developing strategy. "If I purchase this lot," I asked, "would it strengthen my position regarding the road access issue?" "Substantially," she confirmed. "Controlling both the private road and its access point from public roads would create a nearly impenetrable legal barrier to their plans. They would have no grounds whatsoever to claim access necessity." By sunset, I had signed a preliminary purchase agreement with Earl, putting down a $5,000 earnest money deposit from my emergency savings. The closing was set for expedited processing in just 10 days. Earl seemed pleased to unload a property he considered essentially worthless, while I felt the first surge of genuine optimism since this conflict began. The next morning, I visited my bank to discuss financing options. My good credit history and the property's reasonable price made approval straightforward, though the loan officer raised eyebrows at my urgency. I explained it only as investment opportunity timing, rather than revealing my strategic purpose. Over the following week, I worked methodically to secure the purchase while maintaining absolute secrecy about my intentions. I liquidated a portion of my retirement investments to cover the down payment, accepting the penalty as a necessary cost of this defensive measure. My attorney prepared the deed transfer documents with particular attention to access rights language, ensuring no ambiguity about my control over passage through the property. Each evening, I spread property maps across my kitchen table, studying the interconnections between land parcels under warm lamplight. I traced potential access routes with my finger, confirming that my purchase would indeed create a legal barrier the HOA could not easily circumvent. The triangular lot was perfectly positioned to serve as a choke point, controlling access between public roads and my private driveway that the HOA coveted. 2 days before closing, Evelyn called with concerning news. My contacts at the county office say someone from Oak Ridge Heights was inquiring about that same triangular parcel this morning. They may have figured out your strategy. My stomach tightened with anxiety. If the HOA outbid me or delayed the sale with legal maneuvers, my entire defensive plan would collapse. I immediately called Earl, confirming our closing appointment and emphasizing my commitment to the agreed price. Fortunately, Earl was a man of his word, dismissing any notion of entertaining competing offers after a handshake deal had been made. The closing proceeded as scheduled at a small title company office downtown. As I signed the final documents, the weight of my decision pressed upon me. This purchase represented a significant financial commitment, draining savings intended for home renovations and potential medical emergencies. The pen hovered momentarily over the signature line as doubt flickered through my mind. Was this escalation necessary? Was I becoming as unreasonable as I accused the HOA of being? Then images flashed through my memory. Patricia removing my property signs, anonymous threatening text messages, construction vehicles trespassing despite explicit prohibition, Roger Danforth's thinly veiled intimidation at the community meeting. These people had demonstrated repeatedly that they respected neither legal boundaries nor basic decency in pursuit of their objectives. They had initiated this conflict through calculated deception and continued it through intimidation rather than good faith negotiation. My signature flowed across the document with newfound determination. The property transfer completed without fanfare or publicity. The deed was recorded that same afternoon, making me the legal owner of both my original property with its private road, and now the critical access point connecting it to public thoroughfares. For the moment, this remained my secret advantage, a chess move my opponents did not yet realize had happened. As I drove home with the property documents secured in my glove compartment, a plan was already forming for how to use this strategic acquisition to definitively end the HOA's encroachment on my property rights. They had tried to build their community expansion by taking what was mine. Now, I controlled the very ground they needed to stand on to make those plans reality. My newly acquired triangular property sat undisturbed for exactly 1 week, while I finalized preparations for the next phase of my strategy. During this time, I consulted with both my attorney and a local construction contractor who specialized in commercial fencing. We reviewed county regulations regarding property barriers, determining exactly what type of structure could be legally erected without special permits or variances. County code allowed property owners to install security fencing up to 8 feet tall without special permission, provided it met setback requirements from road edges. Gates across private access roads were similarly permitted without restriction. Armed with this knowledge, I developed plans for a substantial barrier that would be both legally unassailable and physically imposing. On Monday morning, exactly 15 days after purchasing the triangular lot, I initiated what I had come to think of as Operation Boundary. The construction crew arrived at dawn, equipment rumbling as they unloaded concrete mixers, post-hole diggers, and steel framing materials. By mid-morning, concrete footings were being poured for what would become a substantial gate and security fence directly across what the HOA had planned as their construction entrance. The workmen moved with practiced efficiency, setting deep concrete pillars to support an electronic security gate across the access point connecting my private road to the public thoroughfare. On either side of this gate, 8-foot security fencing extended to the property boundaries, effectively sealing off any vehicle access through my land. The entire installation featured professional-grade materials, galvanized steel posts, heavy-duty mesh fencing, and a commercial gate operator with keypad access and remote controls. Around noon, a black luxury SUV screeched to a halt beside the construction site. Patricia Wilcox emerged, designer sunglasses failing to hide her expression of utter disbelief. She strode toward the worksite with righteous indignation radiating from her rigid posture. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded, voice pitched high with stress. "You cannot block access to community development property." I approached calmly, maintaining a deliberate composure that contrasted sharply with her agitation. "I am securing my private property," I replied, handing her copies of both property deeds and the county-approved building permit. "This lot is mine. The road behind it is mine. No trespassing." Patricia glanced at the documents, her face contorting as comprehension dawned. "You bought this lot. When? How?" She fumbled for her phone. "This is outrageous. Our attorneys will have this removed immediately." "Your attorneys are welcome to review the completely legal property purchase and the fully compliant barrier installation," I responded. "Everything here follows county regulations to the letter." By evening, the barrier stood complete, imposing, lawful, and unmistakable in its message. The heavy metal gate gleamed in the setting sun. "Private property, authorized access only," signs prominently displayed at regular intervals along the fence line. I programmed the single remote control unit and tested the electronic lock system before the construction crew departed. The physical manifestation of my property rights now stood as an undeniable reality. The HOA could no longer ignore or misrepresent. The reaction was swift and predictable. My phone erupted with calls from HOA board members, alternating between threats of legal action and sudden attempts at negotiation. Roger Danforth's voicemail suggested a reasonable financial arrangement for access rights, while Patricia's messages escalated from demands to speak immediately about this obstruction to offers of community compromise. I forwarded each communication to Evelyn without responding directly. By Wednesday, community social media pages were ablaze with debate about the situation. A neighbor who maintained friendly relations with both sides forwarded me screenshots of the discussions. Some residents condemned what they viewed as selfish obstruction of community progress, while others secretly applauded someone finally standing up to what they characterized as board tyranny. Several commented that the barrier had exposed the board's mismanagement in planning an expansion dependent on property they did not control. Thursday brought the inevitable legal response. A courier delivered a thick envelope containing a formal demand letter from the HOA's attorney, claiming implied easement rights and detrimental reliance on historical access patterns. Evelyn reviewed the documents and dismissed their legal arguments as creative fiction rather than valid legal theory. "They have no case," she assured me. "Their claims of historical access are demonstrably false, and implied easements require conditions not present here. They are throwing legal terminology at the wall, hoping something sticks." Patricia attempted a different approach the following day, arriving at my front door unannounced with a fresh-baked pie and practiced smile. "Neighbors should be able to work through misunderstandings," she began, her tone artificially warm. "We may have gotten off on the wrong foot." I declined the pie but invited her to speak plainly about her purpose. The facade of neighborly concern quickly dissolved when I refused to discuss access rights without my attorney present. As she returned to her vehicle, her parting words revealed her true perspective. You cannot hold an entire community hostage forever. One way or another, progress happens. Throughout these confrontations, I maintained the steady, measured response Evelyn had advised. I referred all legal matters to my attorney, documented every interaction, and focused on the simple, undeniable facts. I owned both properties legally. The barrier was code compliant. No trespassing meant exactly that. The weekend brought unexpected allies. 3 homeowners from Oak Ridge Heights approached me privately, expressing support for my position. They shared stories of the board's previous overreach and lack of transparency regarding assessment funds. One resident, a retired judge, confided that the board had never disclosed potential legal obstacles to their expansion plans despite raising significant funds for the project. Through it all, I remained resolute in my position, anchored by my attorney's repeated assurance. You have done nothing wrong. They have no legal recourse. This is your property to protect as you see fit. The barrier stood as both physical boundary and symbolic statement. Property rights were not suggestions to be ignored when inconvenient but fundamental protections to be respected, and when necessary, enforced. 2 months after constructing the barrier, the conflict entered its final phase. The HOA's legal posturing had proven ineffective, their attorney unable to identify any valid legal theory to force access through my property. Construction on their expansion project stood at a standstill, with equipment sitting idle and contracts accruing delay penalties. The financial pressure had become unsustainable. Most significantly, the prolonged standoff had triggered an internal reckoning within Oak Ridge Heights. Homeowners, frustrated by mounting legal expenses and construction delays, called for accountability. An emergency board election resulted in Patricia Wilcox and Roger Danforth being removed from their positions, replaced by more pragmatic members who prioritized resolution over pride. On a crisp autumn morning, I arrived at a downtown conference room for a formal mediation session. My attorney accompanied me, case files organized and property documents at hand. Across the polished table sat the new HOA representatives, Michael Chen, the new board president, Eleanor Washington, a retired civil engineer elected as treasurer, and their attorney, considerably more measured in demeanor than his predecessor. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Michael began, his tone respectful rather than condescending. We acknowledge there have been serious missteps in how the previous board approached this situation, and we hope to find a path forward that respects your property rights while addressing community needs. The negotiation proceeded with remarkable efficiency once mutual respect replaced adversarial posturing. I made my position clear. I had no obligation to provide access, but was willing to consider a limited easement agreement under specific conditions. These included substantial compensation for access rights, formal recognition of my continued property ownership, and ironclad legal protections against future encroachment. By afternoon, we had outlined an agreement that protected my interests while allowing the community to complete their development with modified plans. They would pay fair market value for limited construction access, with additional annual fees for residential traffic. The agreement included strict usage parameters and automatic penalty clauses for violations. Most importantly, the document explicitly acknowledged my ownership rights and required prominent signage, identifying the road as private property with permitted community access. This is a fair resolution, Eleanor noted as we reviewed the final terms. It respects property rights while finding practical compromise, something the previous board seemed incapable of understanding. Signing the agreement felt less like victory and more like restoration of what should have been from the beginning: mutual respect for clear boundaries and legal rights. I would remove sections of the barrier to allow controlled access under specific conditions, while maintaining ownership and ultimate authority over my property. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of this conflict spread throughout Oak Ridge Heights. The new board initiated transparency reforms, publishing detailed financial reports and creating clear communication channels for resident concerns. Several homeowners approached me privately, sharing similar stories of HOA overreach they had previously been too intimidated to challenge. Most surprisingly, 3 neighboring communities with HOA governance requested presentations on property rights and board accountability, using our conflict as a case study in how not to manage community expansion. My reluctant stand had inadvertently sparked broader conversations about the balance between community development and individual rights. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted across my property, I walked the length of my private road where it bordered Oak Ridge Heights. The modified barrier now included a controlled access gate with clear signage establishing usage rules. Construction vehicles moved through according to the scheduled times in our agreement, operators nodding respectfully as they passed. I reflected on how protecting what matters sometimes requires finding courage you did not know you possessed. For years, I had avoided confrontation and valued quiet coexistence above all. The HOA had mistaken this preference for weakness, never imagining I would draw a firm line when pushed too far. Their miscalculation had cost them time, resources, and community trust. The setting sun cast long shadows from the remaining sections of the barrier, now a physical reminder that boundaries need to be not just declared, but sometimes demonstrably defended. The modified structure stood as testimony to a simple truth: respecting property rights from the beginning would have been easier and more productive for everyone involved. As I walked back toward my house, I noticed Michael Chen approaching from the subdivision side, hand raised in greeting rather than demand. We met at the property line that had once been a source of such conflict. "The first resident moved into the new section today," he mentioned conversationally. "Before they arrived, I made sure they understood the access agreement and the history behind it. No one will take your property rights for granted again." I nodded, appreciating his approach to neighborhood relations. That is all I wanted from the beginning: recognition that this land belongs to someone, not just empty space to be claimed. We spoke briefly about practical matters related to the access schedule, our conversation free from the tension that had characterized all previous interactions with HOA representatives. As Michael departed, he paused. "You know, several residents have mentioned how this whole situation made them look more closely at their own property rights. You standing your ground changed things beyond just this road." Returning home as dusk settled over my property, I felt genuine peace for the first time in months. The road remained mine. The boundary was clear. And perhaps most importantly, I had discovered my capacity to defend what mattered when necessary, even against seemingly powerful opposition. Sometimes the most important lines we draw are not on property maps, but in our willingness to stand firm when those boundaries are challenged. And sometimes, a simple barrier becomes more than physical structure. It becomes a statement that rights have meaning only when we are willing to protect them.